Okay, I'm going to try that and see if that works. Very good.
6:15?
Yeah. Just in time.
Theoretically.
Very cute.
She's off.
So either way. So we'll be doing, I'm going to be doing a theory. There's some people on the camera. If you're in the room and you don't want your voice on the camera, just don't speak. If you do, you're welcome to this. And online, I will periodically look over and see if there's any questions or anything. You can unmute yourself too if you have something that you want to share as we're doing this. So Jordan's not here again this week. I'm picking up for him with theory at last minute. And but the theme this month is it's integral development. And so we've done a couple of times walking through the kind of stages of development as talked about by Ken Wilber. I'm not going to go through the stages themselves. Again, we've been through that a couple of times. So the past couple of sessions, the first one of February and last week's, Jordan went through that and kind of gave a little bit of a detail. I want to talk about it from a little bit of a different perspective, which is it's not so much, it's like there's a sense of what happens as we're going through development. And there's something like the way the stages of development are often presented is like almost a graduation from one mode to another mode. Like I'm graduating from a 2-year-old into a 4-year-old, right? From a 4-year-old. And so we kind of have this linear kind of progressive mindset that it seems like the progression is every step is higher on the ladder. And I think that that's true in a way, but it's also not true in a way. So there's a way that kind of gives us a different perspective about the way that development happens than I think is helpful in the way that it actually occurs. Like especially when we're developing new capacities as human beings on the planet. Like when we're trying to develop into the next phase that hasn't yet been expressed fully, there's not anybody there to tell us what that's supposed to be like. So the curriculum is not written, the coursework's not developed, we don't know what's right and wrong, so we're kind of discovering it as we go. And if something like we're kind of fumbling around in the dark, discovering it for ourselves as it's showing up to us. And it's something like, if I think about the notion of an electromagnetic spectrum, where this is visible light. There's something like, if I think about visible light is just that we can see. It's the range of light that we can see. And we now know that there's a lot of light above and below that, outside of the range, higher and lower frequency light that happens. And we have instruments that show that to us, but before those instruments came about, we had no way of knowing that was there at all. And it's useful as a metaphor. It doesn't work exactly like this, I don't think, but it works something like this. Like what we have talked about with the stages of development so far, you can almost imagine it's like stages of development would be something like that, 1, 2, 3, 4 within that range, and then we would add another range on here or something like that, and just kind of keep going up. Rather than thinking about it like that, where we're adding something on top of it, it's almost like the size of the window grows a little bit as we discover that as we're able to perceive outside of the range, outside of the frame of what we have currently. Like, and so I'm gonna put that as I don't expect it to be understandable right away, but just as a kind of a frame of a difference of the way of this is like expanding the scope of my vision rather than seeing farther, right? And a way that I'll share it that this can kind of work is is something like noticing the way that we use language already. So one of the things that I really love is this notion that language gives us the capacity to grasp concepts and hold on to the world, but it also kind of confines us because we see the way that we see the world through our language as kind of the limits of it, right? In a way, our vocabulary and our language constrains what part of the world we can see. It's not the part of the world that we can see with our eyes, but with our minds, like the part of the world that makes sense to us. And a lovely example that I know about from Terence McKenna is the notion of like a child in a room, and suddenly there's a burst of color and motion and noise, and this something's happening. And this baby looks up and sees this in astonishment of something is happening, but what is it? And the mother responds and says, "Oh, it's a bird." And so the baby's like, "Oh, it's a bird. It's like it has a name and it's understood, and mom's not afraid of it." And so it's like, "Oh, this is what a bird is." And obviously, in some way, nothing has changed about the bird. And nothing has really changed about the perception, except that there's suddenly a layer of interpretation about what this thing is. It's known. Mom's not afraid of it. And it's, there's something about it that I can now grasp more of. So there's something like this is new and it's available to me in a way that wasn't before. And if I think about language as that kind of a thing, I mean, it's a really brilliant example that shows something of overwhelm, intensity, and astonishing incomprehensibility to, oh no, it's understandable. Whereas we don't think about that with most of the things, right? Oh, that's a dog and that's a cat, right? And so there's something of the familiarity of gaining additional vocabulary, and this is a mom and a dad, so there's that language happens and builds, in a sense, the depth of what we can perceive. There's another thing that's kind of interesting as well, which is so I've been fascinated with the notion of Helen Keller. I've mentioned Helen Keller in some of my other talks previously, because there's something with Helen Keller having lost sight and hearing before she really got language. She lost her sight and hearing from a disease when she was about 2 years old. I suspect, she was exposed to language, but didn't have any sense of mastery, and then lost access to taking that in. So it's something frozen at a point in time where it was really just too young an age to be able to do that. And so lived for a good portion of her life until the point where her parents got a tutor and taught, and the tutor, I didn't know this, but the tutor was also deaf. So the tutor knew something about being deaf and taught Helen through a variety of methods, like sound and all sorts of things, but was only trying to really get across the concept that things have handles that I can use to name them, that things have names, and trying to show Helen what a doll was, and then do this. Like, imagine, so in the same way as the bird, right? This fluttering hand, this something vibration, this all this stuff. It's like, I don't know what that is. I have no idea what you're doing. Like, what? It just there doesn't seem to be any correlation between the attempt to, what are these things? How are these things connected? And then one day, chokes me up. One day when Anne, her tutor, ran her hand into water and signed the word for water in her hand, it dawned on Helen that what this was a name, was something that she could grasp as a concept for the water that she was feeling. And it suddenly, the light bulb went on, and suddenly there's a flash of, oh, this has a name. And like the concept was so immediately apparent that she wanted to know the name of everything. It's like, what's this? It's like, yes, I now am hungry to know the names of things. And up till that point, one of the reasons that her parents had hired a tutor is because her world appeared full but inaccessible, right? Helen was full of, she couldn't take in additional information, or the world that she was in was constrained inside of the realm that she was in, and wasn't accessible in the way that it didn't have the range of motion and facility that the parents had and that everyone else had. And this act of teaching the handle blossomed that open, that in a sense, the shell that had been Helen's world cracked and the whole world became possible and known. In some way, this frame of what is knowable opened up immensely to allow in so much more capacity. So there's something really interesting about both sides of that. On the one hand, with the baby who sees the fluttering motion and the mother says, bird. Now bird is this concept, bird is a name, and it's a known thing. The unknownness of it, the stuff outside of it, kind of fades away. And what becomes salient about it is the stuff that we know, right? And so we start to learn the features and things about how the world works through the tool of language that we have about understanding that. So that's that notion of language, that it can afford a widening, but also reinforces the frame. So in a sense, it tightens the frame and opens up the access to what's within that frame. So it's kind of tightening down and opening up at the same time within a certain range. Thoughts or questions about any of that? I like that. So I'm kind of pleased with that as a sense of what that does. And then, so what I'm doing here, looking at this from the perspective of development, is rather than thinking of the graduating, it's almost as I get to a point where the way that the frame that I have and what's inside of it, what's understandable inside of it, I outgrow. Similar, analogous to how Helen outgrew the frame of what she had. And we could see this where a 2-year-old, say, a 2-year-old that's starting to develop a sense of identity, a sense of agency, a sense of mine and boundaries, no, right? And so that point where the child is obviously discovering something, starting to sit, now can get up and walk around and maneuver around the world and start to kind of get a sense of pushing against the old boundaries of what was possible. And in a way, open it up to a new reality, something that that hadn't been available before. And it can't be understood within that frame that it was understood before. In a way, these walls, the old walls, have to fall away. And new walls, this new I, this new self that's perceiving the world, grows. So some new bound of experience is possible. I was reading somewhere, this is really interesting. I only learned this recently, that there's a woman who's looking at doing psychological experiments with children and babies, going from crawling to walking, and looking at how they understand their world. Like a 6-month-old, 8-month-old toddler who's crawling around knows very well, has a good sense of depth perception, and can tell if they can make it safely down a step or down an incline. They can tell by looking at it. They have enough experience to know if is it safe or not. They'll hesitate. If it's safe, it's just right on through. If it's not safe, hesitate. They may ask for help or something. But once the toddler starts, so the crawling child stands up, it's as if the reference frame for what was possible as a crawler is gone. It comes up to the edge and will just walk right off the edge. It has no real sense. I mean, it's like it doesn't adapt the knowing that it had of the world previously. It experiences it freshly. So it's like it will just walk off. And you've seen this. I mean, it's interesting too, watching small children in swimming pools, right? They'll just go off the end. They don't seem to have that sense. But eventually they learn. Gravity teaches them, and they kind of get a sense of what's safe and what's not. And after another 4 or 6 months or so, they do develop a new boundary. They develop enough of the of the sense of the realms of the range of this boundary to have it work again. It's not the same. I would say, we don't know this for sure, but I would say it's pretty clear that it's not the same as it was before. Like it somehow is using some of the same orientation aspects of it, but it's like overlaid on top of it or something. You know, and one of the things that I'm going to jump here for a second. This notion of, you know, it's astonishing when we look at a picture of ourselves as a child and we say, oh, look, that's me. It's like, that's clearly not me. Yes, there's continuity of that being from then to now, and I can remember that. But the world that I was in then isn't the world I'm in now. The access that I have, it is so different that in a way, I suspect that what's happening is that I'm rewriting my history as I go. Every new experience allows me to rewrite what that memory of that experience was interpreted through this frame of the world that I know now. So it's not the same frame. It's a different frame, but it sort of gets pulled along. There's some continuity that gets pulled along with it. And there's a historical aspect of what that felt like, what my memories were. Okay. So that sense of how the frame expands and then has to sort of re-establish itself as a frame, and then within that I develop until it kind of fills up again. I think that that's kind of what happens, is that that happens on an ongoing basis, and when we have a long history with culture and stuff, we can see the patterns of times of life, like the terrible twos and the teenage years and young adulthood, you know, first dating, and then midlife crisis, these moments where it's like there's a clear challenge to the way that we've seen the world before and after. So it's like these threshold moments that are kind of clear that they happen. And you know, that I think is what we're talking about with the stages of development. And so it's not so much an additive as if I'm just graduating, taking all of this and moving to something else. And I think that really encapsulates what we mean by transcend and include, right? The transcending the old boundary is in a sense leaving that frame behind. The frame is what is transcended to something new, a wider frame. The contents of the frame are included inside of the new frame, but they're not actually the same concepts. There's something new about the layer of what I can know about it. The other example that comes to mind that's clearly like this are movies that you watched as a kid, and then you watch again as an adult, and it's like, I didn't know they were talking about sex or whatever it is that they're talking about. You know, that's like the whole missing the concept is like what right over my head, right? An example of that was my son, when he was a teenager, was going through this World War I break, and then found the little plastic knife, this little plastic knife with a big cartoonish Fred Flintstone serrated edge that he used to cut his vegetables. And he picked it up, and it's clearly just this toy. as a teenager, you look at this isn't even sharp. And it's just so funny that the whole concept of knife, you know, that's like, how did I perceive that? Or the small something whenever you're a kid and you remember being at your grandmother's house, just having this huge chair, and you go back and it's like, it's just a regular sized chair, right? So there is something of that. There are moments where we have that sort of surprise before and after reframe, that it's clear that it's not the same world, right? But we miss a lot of it. Okay. So part of why I think this is interesting is because the way that we think that we have access to the world through language, I think in a way that's similar to what I was talking about before, we have an idea of the world that we're in, even when we're seeing beyond it. And it rarely falls apart all at once. It's usually just this gradual, the old way gives way and the new way of seeing it comes into view. You can kind of pay attention, and there are certainly places where I think that this makes sense, but an example, I love some of the YouTube videos where it shows people who video themselves. They're going to learn to play flute or learn to play the guitar over a year, after one day of practice, after one day of playing the guitar, you watch that and it's like, it's very clumsy and okay, kind of get it. And then after 3 days and after a week and a month and 6 months, and it's like, you can definitely see the progression. And there's something like, you can even feel the progression when you do that. Like you can develop fast enough that you can remember, wow, I remember when this was difficult, when this chord was, or this chord change, or this, knowing that it was difficult. And now it's like, I'm actually able to see my progression and step into it. Like I actually understand the world I'm exploring enough that I can start to explore on my own. I don't have to just look at the lessons. I can kind of explore extemporaneously on what's happening in that world. So there are examples where that does show up, and you can see that. But on the large realm, where we're looking at true development of my psyche, my mind, my soul, it still moves at kind of a glacial pace, so that I don't really notice, right? The example that comes to mind like this is if you've lived in the same place for a long time, you can look at your front yard and think, yep, it's my front yard, and then see a picture from 20 years prior. And it's like, oh, that tree used to be small. I don't remember it growing. I don't remember it getting big. But when you compare over that 20-year span, it's like, clearly it did, but it just kind of happened over a period of time. There's something like our development that happens like that as well. Another part of this is supposed to be a brain. So I'm going to do the 3-part brain. And part of this that is along these same ideas is that, the concept that we have when we take psychology or, beginning biology and understand, oh yeah, the brain has this structure, and there's a part, that's part of the spinal cord, and that's the hindbrain, and that's where our balance and our reactive notions are. That's the lizard brain, this hindbrain right back here, the hypothalamus, I think, yeah. Cerebellum, that's right. Cerebellum is back there. And it's very reactive. Like it's dealing with muscle and body at a very low level. It also controls, I believe, I'm not a biologist, so correct me if I get this wrong, but it also is responsible for things like heart rate and blood and oxygen and breathing and all of this stuff, a lot of the automatic stuff that happens in your body. And then on top of that, we have the emotional brain, the mammalian brain, which has the hippocampus, and there are different layers of things that happen at that level. And then on top of that, we have the cognitive brain, this cortex. And human beings, it's really fascinating that our cortex is so much larger than the next primates. And it happened within the span of about 2 million years, that this this whole blossoming of brain tissue within that. And it's tempting to think of them. I mean, you can actually see the physiology of it. When you look at it, you can see that there are different structures. And the temptation is to think that they've remained separate, right? In the same way that I was looking at these layers, that the cortex just sits on top of the emotional brain. The emotional brain just sits on top of, and they're layered like that. But there's something that is not quite accurate about that, right? Because the cortex doesn't do all the processing and then hand it off the emotional layer for the emotional layer to do. The emotional layer doesn't do just get everything that it knows and then communicate in whole terms to the cerebellum. There is constant flow between those, so that like the child walking and making sense of the world, they're reframing it from top to bottom. The experience of balance and walking and the nervous stuff that's happening is happening within the realm of an emotional and cognitive aspect of the world. It's being remapped as they go. So it's kind of all the way down and all the way up as well. It's not just the new stuff is on top and the old stuff is hardwired. So that's one aspect that I think that the notion of development is more complex and more nuanced than I think we normally appreciate. And this is important. Something like encircling this can become very important, because I can come up to a place where I'm interacting, something happens, an emotional flooding happens where I become suddenly surprised by the intensity of some emotion. And like, what's happening there? And I almost can't actually access my words to describe what's going on. Like, there isn't an adequate map of what's happening. And I suspect that it's something like an incomplete mapping of something that was very young, an experience that I had as a child, and it did get some kind of mapping up in my cognitive layer, up in the cortex, but I haven't had access to it since then. And something in a gesture, an aroma, some sudden sense reactivates some old map that brings the experience of that up through the emotional layer where I don't actually have a word for it. Mom wasn't there to say, oh, it's a bird. Oh, this is rage, or whatever. So it's kind of, it has the newness of this fluttering gyration of stuff that is more than I have words for in that instant. But that I can, there's some familiarity to it, obviously, but not the familiarity of the world that I live in. And with circling, knowing that that's there, knowing that I'm more complex than my highest level map, my language has access to. When something like that happens, I can actually start to pay attention to other aspects as well, like pay attention to my breathing, pay attention to my skin. Does it feel flush? Pay attention to like my belly. Does it feel contracted or dropped down, right? So there's like, I can use my ability to focus my awareness on aspects outside of the immediate sense of what I'm experiencing. Right? Like I can do that, kind of noticing something like I've collapsed to another frame, and I can gradually sort of reopen that frame to where I'm at. Didn't expect to go here to that level, but I think that kind of makes sense. So I'm kind of curious if does that make sense to y'all? That there's something like that framing as it unfolds again. It's interesting because in a way it can kind of happen faster than it happened. Like it's a momentary re-updating of this old model to something that I interpret right now. I think the reason it's important to think of, to be aware of that, is because I might be tempted to simply apply a word. This is what I was meaning before. When I apply a word to that, oh, this is what they mean by dissociation. That's dissociation. Okay, I get it. Now I understand what dissociation is. In a way, I prematurely collapsed the notion of a dissociation. And I may, that there actually may be a benefit to that, right? I think there can be a utility, a usefulness to having something to be able to deal with the world that I'm in right now, to be able to set that aside, to be able to kind of override the sensation a little bit in order to maneuver through the world at this moment, right? As I'm saying that, it's almost like I imagine that the experience of being in shock is something like that. When something traumatic happens to you, you're in a car accident, and you're trying to maneuver through the world. You can walk, you can talk, you can do something, but you're clearly in a different state of mind. Remember a story of someone who was in a car accident, hit their head on the windshield, just got out of the car and walked back home, and walked into the kitchen, sat down, got a cup of coffee, and mother walks in and is like, what happened to you? He says, what? It's like, you're bloody from head to toe. Oh, I don't know. Like, just that sense of going to some level of normalcy, but clearly, filtering out a lot of the current experience. I can see how that can be beneficial on a survival mechanism of like, yeah, I'm able to move, I'm able to do something. Not sure if that's an exact thing that's happening there, but it makes sense to me that might be something like what's happening in there. But that sense of these layers constantly interacting, and yet something can bubble up through it, right? Something from way down in here can bubble up to the top and be a new experience, something that I didn't know. I want to try something here. There's a notion that's similar to this, which is the notion of a volcano. So I'm going to jump a little bit from psychology to earth sciences. And there's something interesting here with earth sciences that is not completely dissimilar. It's a very different model. This is David's metaphor of like taking big picture things and zooming them in and out. The notion of life on Earth has different densities and time spans. So there are researchers who look at it and say, we have 4 layers of life. There's the lithosphere, which is the stone layer, which is what we're talking about with the Earth's crust and the magma underneath and the volcanoes. There's the aquasphere, which are the oceans, the water that's covering the surface of the Earth. The atmosphere, which is all of the oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide that surrounds that on top of the oceans. And these are the layers of that. And then there is the biosphere, which is the life that lives within that whole range, but is also a kind of sphere within that's doing something. So it's moving around. And each of the layers depends on the others. The iron that's necessary for our blood to work and oxygenate, to carry oxygen to our brains, has to happen by the Earth going through this periodic explosion process, bringing elements from down below up above, and the whole tectonic plate system is rotating around. In the same way that if you look back, you can see the water, the ocean, and the water in the oceans is circulating. And when you look at the atmosphere, you can see these vortexes of atmosphere going around, and life itself is rotating around. And it's essential for those parts to kind of mix and find ways of finding stability. It doesn't work in a way that it's the base layer stable, and we build on top of that, and the next layer is stable, and then we build on top of that. It has a continual process of different frequencies, right? The lithosphere moves very slow. And the eruptions from the lithosphere are disruptive. They impact the atmosphere, throwing dust into the atmosphere and moving the water very powerfully. But the systems within those each respond to that change. So the ripples that start from the lithosphere moving ripple through the oceans, ripple through the air, ripple through life. And those ripples continue through developmental changes. So one of the things that's really astonishing is now we're learning how many civilizations have been buried by volcanoes, right? And life pops up again, in the same way that a forest fire can blaze through and devastate a forest, and then it sprouts up again. It continues to renew, refolding and regrowing out of these layers that aren't static, move at different speeds. There's something like this deep lizard brain, mammalian brain, and primate brain are also going through changes. The kind of deep change that's happening at the lizard brain level is less speedy. There's not as much happening there in terms of what's going on, but when something does, in a sense, when the constraint of the maps that we have above hold it too tightly, something must erupt to shift that, to break that frame, to open it up, to allow for something else to move. So this notion that we're moving from these frames and expanding isn't so much a graduation from one layer up to the next where the previous layers are the same. Just like the me that I remember as a child isn't the same me that I was when I was a child. They're reframed and reformed continually. Okay, so that's it for the layering parts, and that kind of moving away from stacking these to kind of expanding the frame. There's also something else that's interesting in the way that we learn that is kind of invisible until you start to experience it, and this is looking at the sense of the poles, and this is kind of like are the edges of the frame, one edge down below and one edge above. Like these edges have different a different sense, and there's something like the example I'm going to use here is like a compass, north, east, west, south. So on a compass, the poles of north and south are useful because we can tell which direction it is and we can do navigation. They're even discovering now that birds and fish, some sharks can see the magnetic lines. I'm not sure exactly what seeing looks like, but the nerves in the eye can actually tell when they're swimming in line with the current or when they're swimming cross current. So animals in the sea and birds in the air can fly across long distances because they can perceive that very subtle variation. Not only can they perceive the difference in whether they're flying with it or against it, but they can tell if it's strong or weak. And the nuance of how small the variation, the magnetic field line, the flux lines are, and that kind of north-south are impossible for us to actually even measure. They now believe that that's a quantum mechanism. There's something that's happening inside of the cell that's sensitive to the magnetic flux, that's giving feedback about how we navigate through the world. Side note. But this notion of the compass isn't to say, oh, well, north is best. I always want to be at north. That's the direction that I want to be, and that's where I want to live. That's not the point of it, right? It's the being able to tell the difference between the two, right? Am I in line with this, or am I crossways to it? That gives me a sense of knowing that. And they've actually done experiments. This is a really interesting experiment where they have a belt.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah, a belt that has a point on it that vibrates, and the point of vibration, it's like these little vibrators all around the way around it, and it always vibrates in the direction of north. Whatever direction you're pointing in, you know which direction is north. And the brain, without you thinking about it, just through your experience of knowing where north is, you don't have to think about it at all. Walking around with this, you start to develop a sense of north. Not only do you develop a sense of north, you develop a map in your mind of the terrain that you're in. You know where you are. You just know. Like, oh yeah, that's over there. And yeah, I went to have breakfast over here, about 200, a mile over that way. It's like your brain just incorporates that information, layers it on top of the map, and then you have access to it.
What happens when the belt is removed? Do they lose that map?
It's a good question.
They felt really lost. Disoriented.
So it's interesting because my wife actually has a temporal map that's like that. In her mind, it works a little differently than this belt, but in her mind, she sees the visual image of the calendar. The odd thing is it isn't uniform. It's not like numbers on a clock. It's like January and February are up here, and it goes in order, but everything else, a lot of stuff gets clumped down here on the left. And so it's like it's not some map. Nobody taught it to her, but in her mind, when she's thinking about somebody's birthday, she knows, oh yeah, that's over here, and this is my anniversary is over here, right? And she has, it's like a little Rolodex system in her head, like a little lookup tool. She can think about, oh yeah, it's this time of year, and this is all the stuff that happens right now. She also has that in the area of town. So she's in a certain area of town, and she'll like, oh yeah, this is where I want to go shopping over here and over there, and someone's over here, and I'll drop this off with her. Like, I don't have that at all. I don't have any access to this associative memory that has the location of things or temporal location of things. So I'm imagining everybody has their own thing, but the way that the brain actually makes sense of that, like the fact that evolution can find in birds and fish a mechanism that can discern just a slight difference that can be extrapolated into a way of making sense of the world is amazing. But this only happens because there's a difference between one thing and another, because there's a difference between north and south. This isn't because I know where north is. It's because I can tell the difference between being aligned with it, not being aligned with it. When I'm closer to this and when I'm closer to that, it gives me a sense of a layer of the world that I'm in that expands the frame of my awareness of that world. I think that something similar happens, same kind of a thing that happens between masculine and feminine. I'm going to try to avoid getting into any trouble here because I don't think I know what that means, but something like the experience that men have and the experience that women have is different. And again, off of my area of expertise, the kind of difference that's there differs from culture to culture. Some cultures, the degree of variation between the masculine perspective and the feminine perspective varies. And sometimes what happens within that realm of perspective, like in matriarchal societies, the women are the leaders who take charge of things, and so it's not always that feminine looks a certain way and that masculine looks something else, but there is a kind of polarity. There is a kind of a this and thatness to male and female that has a kind of a tug, a pull, a way of differentiating between them. It's not always the case. There are some species that switch sexes that will sometimes be male and sometimes be female, depending on what's needed. So life is infinitely varied and doing some really interesting things. But this aspect of the poles is an interesting notion of a way of distinguishing something of where I'm at in the world and where I want to be. An aspect of this I think is interesting is twins. I had the insight a while back, and I think this is true, that twins who are raised together are more different than twins who were separated at birth and raised apart. That's a hypothesis. I don't know if there's been any studies that have looked at that specifically, but there is a movie called Three Identical Strangers. If you haven't seen that, I recommend it. It's a really interesting movie. It's three triplet boys who were separated at birth, raised separately, and discovered each other. First pairwise, because one of the brothers went to a school that his twin brother had left. They didn't know each other, but everybody kept coming up, calling their own name, punching him, and like, hey, how's it going? And he's like, who are these people? And when he finally realized, oh, you're not so-and-so, you're like, you look just like him, you act just like him. And so he got on the news, and as they're watching on the news, the third triplet sees that. It's like, what? There are twin brothers that are me, and they get together and meet. And there are differences in their personality, but there are a lot of strong similarities. And it's also very troubling for them as trying to come up with their identity. Like the sense of dissonance, resonance that happens between them is kind of weird. So there's something like raised in the same family, there's something of a needing to distance myself. And at the same time, there's something that's very familial and close as well. So there's not a one thing that does, but the impact of having differences and the way that those differences are accentuated and minimized, the way that we expand into the frame and contract against the edges of the frame and change over time, I think is an important aspect of development that shapes the way that we grow, the way that we mature. What time is it? Okay, cool. So I got 15 minutes. Part of why this is very interesting to me is the more that I learn about development and have a sense of what the complexity of what's going on, the more fascinated I am by it. And circling is one of those things that I really enjoy as a way of exploring my movement through the world and my movement through my growth, right? So all of a sudden I can almost, through this, have a sense of my navigation through my frames. I'm not just aware of navigating within the frame, but I can actually see the frame itself. I think that this is, in previous talks, whenever Jordan's talked about this, this is where we start to talk about construct aware, where I start to become aware of the frame that's holding me. I've been through this enough times that it's kind of like, oh, it's not the same as the last frame, but it does have that feeling of the world is new now. It's something that's happening. The values that I have are shifting. There's something in that overturning of the iceberg is starting to topple, right, and do something else. And I can start to recognize that. And as that happens, I can start to get a sense of the practices that allow me to engage with that, right, and move through that in a more fluid way. I mentioned before I started the talk, I've been reading Carl Jung's, actually I'm still only in the introduction, Carl Jung's Red Book, which I hadn't read before, and it's only been published recently. But one of the things that's really interesting is that when he first started writing this down, he was having a lot of dreams, and he was actually talking to entities as if they were people. He's talking to his soul as if his soul was a person talking back to him. When it started happening, he was sure that he was losing his mind. Part of the reason that the book didn't get published is because how does anybody even interpret that? It doesn't make sense. But his courage to actually write down as truthfully as he could what his experience was is part of what allowed him to have a sense of the development over time. And one of the things that he recognized, it wasn't so much him that was losing his mind. It was culture that was losing its mind. The time that he was writing was just coming up to World War I. And when he realized, oh, war is imminent, this is us losing our mind. We're losing our collective identity of who we were, and we're shifting into something else. The culture sphere, right, is in a tumultuous moment. And there's, I have to say, don't take any of this for fact. This is David's exploration in metaphor land. So this is kind of riffing on these ideas as a way of exploring them. But something in that sense does have a way of noticing, the frame, the frame of these different eras. Am I moving inside of the frame, or am I moving against the grain of the frame? Gives me a little bit of a different flavor. I can start to, over time, if I'm actually sensitive enough to my experience and noticing what's happening, I can feel whether I'm growing or whether I'm deepening within the frame. This little story, this is something that's really interesting. We noticed with our kids a pattern that I'd never noticed with other kids, partly because we're watching them. I could tell when my son was getting ready for a growth spurt. He'd plump up. I was like, oh, that's weird. And it's like this very odd sort of a thing. It's like very clear. Wow, you got fat. Okay, boom, now you're shooting up. And it was this, and I think that we do something like that in development, right? We broaden into the frame that we're in, and then use the energy of that to propel ourselves up into deepening that frame. Part of what I love about circling and about the exploration in this kind of a node is there are ways of paying attention. Once I have that sense of the frame and what it feels like to go across grain or with the grain, I can start to pay attention to the strength of that, right? So that notion that I could tell, not only am I going with or against, but am I closer up here to the top, or am I closer down here to the bottom? And kind of the same as the sharks and birds swimming in the magnetic line and being able to tell what's stronger and what's weaker. And I can actually almost tell at a subtle layer what's happening. I can tell the kinds of experiences that I'm having that are challenging me in some way, that I'm kind of leaning into growth. a little bit here. Like I can, or I can tell when, okay, that's too much. Take a break. It's time to go and do something. I want to go see a movie. I want to go do something fun. I'm not doing any work today, right? There's something like I'm being able to tell about that. But there's this past weekend I did a workshop with John Vervaeke, my favorite cognitive scientist, online. And one of the things that we did was actually using the concepts of circling to explore virtues. So explore courage or love or innocence as an entity. And it was interesting because we actually started off before we even got to that point. We studied a text very slowly, like getting into a meditative state, dropping in, becoming centered, and then reading the text slowly. And then, the reader would read it slowly and then pick a phrase that he felt epitomized. It's just like a paragraph. Pick a phrase that epitomized the text, and then each person would repeat the phrase, accentuating it in a way that felt meaningful for them. And the text that we read was a paragraph from I and Thou, from Martin Buber's I and Thou. And the notion of I and Thou comes alive for me in the exploration of that in a way that it didn't before. The I-thou relationship is not I as a person and you as a person. It's I as a self and you as a self world holding me, right? Like that. We are co-influencing. The sense of both of us expanding into this nowness, into this beingness, happens only because of the relationship that pole, but the relationship of the poles to one another, the way in which this sense is giving me. And Buber says it's not like the blood that courses through our veins, but like the air that we breathe in and out. It's like that thing that holds us. And in that sense of the I thou, there's something of recognizing the I thou within myself. I have memory of myself, but it's not an object. It actually is a subject. It still is in me, responding in the moment to this I that is perceiving that responding. Like and as I'm exploring that, the bounds of the frame shift noticeably. Like that feeling of vertigo when something happens where it's like, whoa, your world frame expands enough that it's like time out, something like get down low, something's moving. That sense can be very powerful. And in that moment of getting a sense of, oh, this I thou-ness is not some trick. It's almost like the trick that happens is the notion that I am a stable self, that I, even as I consider myself as a subject, treat myself as an object. Oh yeah, I'm this David. Ta-da, speaking up here, right? And it's so pervasive, it's so tangible that it's almost hard to get out of that. In the moment of slowing down and reading this text and feeling how the text was giving me myself was so astonishing. I still have a flavor of that, and I can feel now the givenness of who I am and how I'm speaking to you now is given by how you're listening to me. Like wouldn't be the same talk if I were giving this tomorrow. It's happening now, and this givingness is unfolding now. And there's something that at the same time that I can almost uncover the astonishing aspect of my words can't contain the experience of the bigness of this. And I can also access the, from the overwhelm, find the aspects that are tangible back within the realm of, and I know where the frame is as well. Something of a fluidity of between non-duality and duality. I can move back and forth between those extremes, those poles. and it's the practice of doing it, circling, and the practice of doing something like the exploration of this gives me a way of orienting to my experience that's kind of similar to that belt of the north. Oh, there's something vibrating. There's something I can tell. There's something I'm aware of as I'm moving. I start to notice how my body, how my belly, my breathing, and my emotions start to respond to my movement and relating shows up such that I kind of know more about where I'm at and where I might go, how I might explore the edges of that, where I might feel, I want to go in this direction, but I feel constrained at this point, metaphorically stepping to the edge of that frame, noticing there's something beyond it. Can I feel what is in the shadows and the void beyond where I'm able to see that is actually calling me forth? Can I feel the healthiness within that? Outside of this frame is something that's holding me even deeper. I'm inspired by the kind of exploration of this. As I'm looking at it, I'm inspired by exploring the nuance of some of these exercises. I have looked at parts work and like family constellation work and constellation, family constellation and entirely family systems. I always get those two intertwined. But those are two ways that look at parts. But this exploration that I did this weekend and looking at the virtues allowed me to interact with the virtue in a way, like choosing innocence to look at. What is my proposal of what innocence is? And innocence is that primordial newness, that unfettered newness that has not yet experienced limitation, bouncing up against limitation, right? It is that moment. And one of the questions that came up was, what happens, what if the sense of guilt? And it's like, and isn't that interesting? And guilt kind of gives me a sense of the new boundary of innocence expanding into it, like this continual rippling edge of growing into. And the exploration of that gave a sense of something that happens where it's a small enough piece of my experience that I can focus on it and get to the edge of overwhelm without being completely overwhelmed. I'm not actually deconstructing my whole identity. I'm just looking more deeply at one aspect of my experience through this one particular lens or line of the boundary that opens something up. And it's like, that actually becomes much more tangible and possible to look at. So it's like there's some way that becoming aware of the nuance of where I am in this range of experience gives me the capacity to explore more nuance within it, but that smaller scale increments and also at larger scale increments. Whew. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up there. Questions or thoughts that convey pretty well? Even like it's
I have no idea what you said, and I'm so happy. I just let your words flow over me, and it felt great.
wonderful, wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Covered a lot.
Yeah. Talk to y'all later.